had it all prepared, and it's just like what happens sometimes, Pastor Dan. You just, at 4:30 in the morning, the dog barked outside, and I thought that's why I was waking up. But then I said, okay, Lord, is that why I'm waking up? And then the thought came, you're supposed to put together a short sermon on the gospel. So here it is. So I went ahead and I thought back to that day when that biker came to church and he needed the gospel. And maybe that's why all of a sudden it came to me at 4:30. And I went from 4:33 when I got out to the fire, and I said, okay, I'm going to time it and see how long it takes me to do this, Lord, so I can share it factually tomorrow. It took me from 4:33 to 4:53, roughly 20 minutes, including the slide design and everything else, and putting these animations on where it looks like a cross coming in and all of that. 20 minutes, and this is what I had. So I had basically a life question developed. And if you want to use this as a sermon or take it and use it as an outline, I put it in the chat, and there's sections in the chat. You can grab it there, or you can snapshot this one off the screen if you know how to do that. And so this is what I came up with. And as I did this, I was thinking to myself, what happened that day was this man was facing a lot of uncertainty. Now, if you want to think about the Hells Angels, how do I know this guy was a Hells Angel? Well, what happened was during the middle of that sermon, this was a few years ago, I had my course set, but the night before, the prompt came, you might need to change it up today. And I didn't know exactly who would be there that day. I didn't know that this gentleman would be there that day. And as I got up there to speak, that's when the prompting really came strong, and I just went into this gospel sermon. And it was similar to this, a little different, wasn't quite as many texts. And then I just said, if God is putting on your heart today that you need to be right with him, that you somehow feel like you are not close to him and you want to give your heart to him today, see me at the door. And you know, that happens, right? Or you come up for prayer, you ask him to do that. And sometimes you get one or two people for special prayer. But this guy comes to the door and he's in tears. I mean, and I'm a man who doesn't cry. So when I see another man kind of just breaking down, I put my arm on him and say, are you okay? And he looks up, and he's got facial hair. He's got some, not street clothes. I mean, they look neat and clean, but not your usual church wear. And he's like, I need to talk to you now. So I told the members, I said, sorry guys, there's an elder over there. And I took him to the office with another elder, and he holds out his hand and he says, do you know what this is? Now, on his hand, between his thumb and his pointer finger, was a skull with flames around it. And I said, God, give it to me. And he said, Hell's Angel. He's a Hell's Angel. I said, you're a Hell's Angel. And he said, almost like he wanted to know how I knew that, but I said, you're a Hell's Angel. And so tell me your story. He was a son of the founders of the Hell's Angels, and he was trying to get out. And he didn't know what he was going to face if he got out or tried to get away from it all. So he wanted to have his heart right with God. And he said, can God do that for me? And I said, well, you hear what I said? I said, yeah, but for me, can you do it for me? Do you know what I've been through? He just started coming out with all his baggage. And the elder and I listened for a little bit, and then I just said, here's some simple steps. Let's go through them. We talked about God and how, kind of like this biblical answer here. I didn't go through all of those. I actually went from Genesis. I skipped down to John and talked about the creator there, who was actually Jesus. And then I went and talked about how he died for us. And that somehow resonated with this guy, that somebody would die for somebody else. Like he had our back, that kind of thing. And then I went into Romans and how this was a beautiful gift. And all we have to do, and I took him back down to 1 John 5:13, is ask. Verses 13 to 15 says you can know and you can ask. And I don't remember everything else that was said that day in that office. I just remember praying for him. Then he wanted to pray a brief little prayer, and then I prayed for him again, and I gave him John 5:24. So last night I was like, okay, if I had to write that all out into a sermon, and I had to use that on the spot. What would I do? And this is it. I'd have my life questions. I had two of them. Excuse me here. Let me go back over here. What if we could face the future with certainty? Right? That was what this guy really wanted. He wanted whatever happened. And by the way, I didn't see him. He disappeared 2 weeks later. I don't know what happened to him. His street name, he told me, was Hellboy. And coincidentally, I'd been working with some other people on the street, and Hellboy did not have a good name on the street. People disappeared when he came around. So I don't know if he disappeared. I don't know what happened to him, but he was facing uncertainty, and he needed certainty. And whatever he latched onto, like a drowning person, he just latched onto during the sermon. He would not let go until he had it. Now, you're not going to have people like that in every audience. You know, if you're giving a sermon on the gospel, and I may say something like, okay, people, I would talk to my congregation and say, you know, if it may not be that today you need this exact sermon, but God has put it on my heart to give this sermon. And maybe you could take some of these principles and share it with somebody else. But there's somebody here today that I'm supposed to be speaking to, and this is why I'm giving this sermon today. Some people wonder why you're giving the basic gospel sermon. And I would just tell the members, you know, maybe this is something you're supposed to share with somebody else soon, or maybe there's somebody here today. And I would launch into this, and then I would give the biblical answer, and then I would give the life application. And the life application would be basically, do you see how the Creator left heaven to live this perfect life and to die for you? And that he's alive today. And since he's alive, you can call out to him. You can ask. Oh, I just don't know if I'm good enough. I don't know if God would hear me. And I'm like, okay, well, let's look in the Bible. 1 John 5:13 talks about, these things I write to you so that you may know that you have eternal life. And it goes on and it says, if you ask anything according to his will, he hears us and he will give to you what you've asked of him. You guys know some of this, right? So the person who's doubting today, it's as simple as asking. And sometimes in the middle of evangelistic sermon, what I'll do is I'll have one of those big giveaway books, or even on a Sabbath morning, maybe I'll have a gift, and I'll invite someone forward, and I'll literally just say, would you like this? And it's, yeah, I'd like to have that Bible dictionary. Yeah, I'd like to have that Bible atlas. And I hold it out, and they look at me like, is he really going to give this to me? And then they take it. And then I have the person sit down, and then I turn to the audience. That's during evangelistic sermon. During a Sabbath morning, I'll get down there and I'll just say, all right, you've heard this wonderful message about Jesus. I want to tell you what God did for me. And I just launch into my testimony. And my testimony is a jail cell. It's a day room of a cell block up in Douglas County. And how God used somebody, whoever it was, to put a piece of literature that had some of this stuff that I shared today. And it touched my heart. And I would just tell how I called out to God. And my prayer was simple. Here's my life. It's a mess, God. Take control. I'm just giving it to you. That was it. I didn't have any biblical confession prayer or believer's prayer or anything. And even the back of the book had a prayer I could have prayed, but I couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand any of it. So I just called out to God. And then I basically tell the audience, I asked the question, is it that easy? I mean, I'm standing here today, and here I am giving a preaching class today because God did that. Surely he can still do it today. So that's a brief sermon outline right there. And once again, like last night, someone said it's simple. It is simple, but it will get to the heart of the matter. And so if you want a simple gospel presentation sermon, you can take that and put your own story and your own maybe your own Bible verses if those don't make sense, and you can use that as your own. But I thought I'd give that because we're calling this preaching with a purpose, and I don't want to leave out the simple reality that God may call you even on the spur of the moment to give the gospel during your sermon, and you got to be ready to do it. And when we do field schools, I do a field school with my elders every time I do a series of meetings. And they basically have to have a gospel presentation memorized by the time we kick off opening night, because come the first week, we're all out visiting every single person who came, and we're seeing if their hearts are right with the Lord or not. And if they're not, what are we waiting for? I mean, I cleared a guy in Medford at my field school when I was trained, who was a biker. He came peeling into the parking lot of the Medford at Seventh-day Adventist Church. He was mad. I mean, he was angry. He said he hated the Seventh-day Adventist Church because when he was younger, he went and they were so worksy driven that Jesus wasn't in it. And I found that other church members outside of the church were more focused on Jesus. And I'm back here tonight. So what? You know, he was in my face. And the other young guys were like, how do I respond to this guy? He's angry. And he came at me, and I came back at him. And then the next night he comes in and he says, I'm talking to you. And I'm thinking, my old nature, I'm a fighter, guys. I mean, my brother and I used to rumble a lot when we were growing up. And that was almost like the old man was like thinking, oh, here it is. And a still small voice is like, just listen. And not that I would have fought with him, but just, you know, that old feeling that this is fight language. And pointing the finger at me, and he said, you come with me. And I'm like, okay, Lord, I'm going to go with the guy. I hope, you know, I don't think anything's going to happen. I'm not afraid. I go out there, and we end up going through the same presentation like this right here, the gospel, in his truck. And I said to him, is that something you want? He's like, well, duh, man. Duh. I want that. How do I get that? And I prayed for him. And then I said, would you like to call out to God in your own words? And he called out to God. And then I prayed for him again. That's that whole thing at the end there. Pray for, pray with, pray for. And then I gave him Jack Cologne's follow-up track and circled John 5:24. And he just kept coming and coming. He became a deacon in the Central Point Church up there. And for years, I kept in track with him until he had cancer. And I don't know what happened to him. He's no longer on Facebook. But it was something simple like this. So you have this potential sermon outline. You can take it and use it for a public meeting, or you could use it for a private visit with somebody. And that way you can feel confident that what if somebody needs to know Jesus? What do I do? And this doesn't give you all the details, but it gives you enough that you could offer the gospel to somebody. So that's in the chat. I wanted to put it there. I'll put it up on the screen a couple more times during our time together, but I wanted to give that to you. And that took 20 minutes from start to finish to type that sermon out on a PowerPoint slide and get the transition and everything just right and the text boxes just right. So I would say it took me about 10 minutes to just get all the main text that came to my mind. But I could do it in 5 minutes if I only want to do a snippet. So that's my little testimony from 4:30 in the morning. So it is that simple. We looked at the life question concept yesterday, and you had that reflection sheet. And that's not meant to be the Holy Spirit. If you find over time you don't need that, then just set it aside. But maybe if you have trouble getting going, that life question reflection sheet will help you. And then once you have a life question in mind and some possible biblical texts, we're going to then focus on the biblical answer this morning at 9:30 here, and then 11 o'clock. And then in the afternoon, we'll focus kind of on the life application. So the biblical answer, this is what Pastor Dan was talking about. At some point, you're going to write a manuscript or an outline or something to organize yourself. And we will go through some examples of this this morning. I'm going to pause a little bit further on for questions. So if you have any questions, mark them down and we'll get to them in a few minutes. So as you look in your, let me look here. Maybe I went to the wrong slides. There's slides here. Let me see. No, we're there. We're good. All right. So you guys know what a soapbox is, right? We typically think of somebody standing on the soapbox, slipping and falling on the soap and getting in the bathtub, right? They stayed on that topic too long, right? It's just their passion. But you know how soap used to be distributed in boxes and such, and some people would take on the street and they would stand on a box, or they'd stand on, like Hello, Mr. Fudge. The guy stands on the bike, right? And he starts preaching. He's arguing with the other guy, right? And then he falls off his bike in the movie, right? So you have someone basically standing up and they're preaching their heart out. And think of it as a positive term, not a negative term. And it's what what Dr. Wiberding calls a presidential soapbox. I call that more of a topical sermon, or if you go to homiletical class, they would call it a topical sermon. And then you have the explorer's quest. And then you have the text-led sermon. Let me see where I'm at on your pages here. You know what? Give me one moment here. I feel like I'm skipping something. Yes, I am. I'm sorry. It was that gospel presentation. I put it in the wrong. Oh, there it is right there. I'm sorry. I'm way ahead of you. I'm actually at 11 o'clock now. Sorry. All right. So we're talking about the biblical part now, and we're going to focus on making that outline. There we are. That's where I needed to be. And we're looking at page 4 of your handout number 3. And I guess I gave you a preview of where we're going next, but handout number 3, page 4. That's where we're at. So a sermon outline should have some kind of simple point. Now, like for instance, at 4:30 in the morning, it was the gospel. That was the main idea, the good news for today. For today, even with all this stuff going on. So that's the simple point. And you may need to remind people of that point repeatedly, but it has to come from the text. And if you look at this picture of, well, what do you think that's at? You know, that looks like the surface of the moon, right? Or something. That's actually Cinder Cone near Mount Lassen. And it's a hike that a lot of people don't go on because it's on another part of the park besides the main drag. And as you get up there on this rim, you can literally, like right in front of you right there is some looks like gravel and stuff, and you got this path on the rim right there. You can walk that rim all the way around, and there's another path on the far side that kind of goes down into the crater. And you feel like you're on another planet until you look up and look around and you see the mountains. And you're like, oh, okay, there's Mount Lassen, or there's a piece of Brokaw or one of the other mountains. And so if you look at this picture here, this picture is supposed to emphasize a simple point. You're really looking at the crater. You're not looking at the mountain. You're not looking at the clouds. You're not looking at the sky. At a certain point, when you're drafting your outline, there's a simple point that comes out, and that's what you got to focus on. You can't go every which way. And we'll talk about going noteless and how the problems of not having notes will be sometimes you can go out there in the periphery when the text is really focusing there in the crater. So we'll use that for our simple point picture. Then the representative portion. So you have a simple point, but what if the point doesn't seem to fit? Or what if it seems distorted? It'd be like looking at the clouds up here on this picture and forgetting that you're actually standing right there in front of Bryce Canyon. So you can't just, if the point seems to distort the rest, and you forget the rest of the context, you could be in trouble there. So you got to have a simple point, but also make sure it represents what the author's saying around the verses, the chapter, the rest of the book. And of course, we're Seventh-day Adventists. We take the whole totality of Scripture in our historical method. So that's representative, has to be representative. And then it has to be a complete picture. And this is, these pictures, I took all 3 of these. This one is the delicate arch. It was not a delicate hike down. I tripped and fell and sprained my ankle, something awful. And still am messing with it today. But we got up there, and there again, you could take a picture of this arch, right-hand side of it, left-hand side of it. There was all these crows in front of it, huge, I mean, a bunch of crows. They'd come right up to you, black crows. Or you could zoom in on the mountain, but you want a whole complete picture. You want the whole thing to kind of fit together. And that goes back to that simple point and the representative portion. If it seems like by the time you're done, you got your simple point, you've read around it, and then all of a sudden it just doesn't seem to fit together, something's wrong. And it could be that you need to spend some more time in prayer and say, okay, God, this is just not flowing. This is just not, maybe Pastor Dan can attest. You start going through that outline and there's a hiccup in there, so to speak. It just, not sure about that. And you got to go back through and reconsider your main point, reconsider your portion around it maybe again and say, okay, is there something I'm missing, Lord? And it could be there's nothing you're missing in the text, but the context of the whole Bible, there's something you're missing in the Old Testament or something that lends itself to that text. And now all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, there it is. So when you're doing an outline, you want that simple point. You want to make sure you choose enough piece of scripture that you can get a surrounding, but then at the end, it's got to fit together. When you start going down through your outline, it's got to fit together. So let's talk about the simple point. So you're going to get, this is like getting the lay of the land. And when you look at that text, you've got to ask that question: can I draw a single simple point from these verses? If you're on the Sermon on the Mount and you can't draw a single point from the whole sermon, that means you've got too much. You've got too much probably to talk about that day, and you're going to have to deal. You're going to have to narrow it down. And you're like, well, I want to talk about the whole sermon, or I want to talk about the parable of the sower, the whole parable today. Well, you may not get to the whole parable that day. Let's face it. And sometimes when you're preaching every week, you don't want to get to the whole parable. You're going to piece it out in a sermon series. And when the pastor asks you to preach again, you got another one ready to go, right? So if you can't draw a single simple point, what's going to happen is you either bit off too much that you can chew, so to speak, or it's so narrow. Jesus wept, right? You could preach a sermon on that, especially if you're African American or you have an alliteration background. You could really just boom, boom, wordsmith. Yeah, I could see Ron Halverson Jr. Senior doing that, but most of us aren't that. So you may not, if you're reading a verse and all of a sudden a main point doesn't come out, that means it's either too narrow or too thick, too much. And so these are the questions you ask. Can I draw a single simple point from these verses? Is the point clear from the passage I've chosen? And if it's not clear, you might say, maybe this isn't the passage for now. Maybe I need to find something different that answers this life question. And that happens periodically when I'm going through and doing a book, like a book of Hebrews or James I did a while back. And I'm going through and I'm thinking I was going to preach on a certain piece of it. And then I'm going through and I'm like, I'm studying it this week. It seems to answer part of the life question, but I feel like my audience is going to need more than that. So I got to go. Maybe I'm going to choose another piece of that passage instead. So what I do is I reread the selected verses that I've prayed about. I got a life question. I've considered my passage. I've chosen it. Then I reread it. And I'll sometimes read it in multiple versions if I have time. If I don't, I choose my one that I really like, and I'll go through it a couple of times. On the second reading, I start marking down ideas that are emerging from it. And then I can try to answer that question about, is there a simple point? And then the follow-up question over here, when you're rereading it, is, should I focus on, because there's a simple point, but there could be little subpoints underneath it. You know, how you're reading through, Jesus talking about the light of the world, and it seems like that's the main idea. But then as you keep reading on, there could be some other things that come out, and those are subpoints. Well, those aren't going to spend all your time on. You're going to spend your time mostly on the main point, but these will help you bolster your main point. And as you look at and you find subpoints, you may find out that there are too many subpoints to focus on in one sermon, and you may not want to focus on all of them. So should I focus on all of them, or one of them? And that will be something you're going to have to answer with the passage. Then I read the passage again a third time, just to be sure. I'm going through, I'm reading it again. All right, there's the main point again. There's the subpoints. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to get all those in 30 minutes or 40 minutes, or well, sometimes I preach for over an hour. So that's when I'm not there very often, right? I got 10 churches now, so I basically, when I come, they're like, preach, pastor, just preach. And so I supervise 10 churches. I'm not the leader of each one of them. So representative portion then. So that's the main point back there. Simple main point with subpoints, reading it, marking them down. Now remember, you're forming an outline here, and this is how you go about it. Then you ask yourself this question. This is a representative portion. Do the isolated verses correctly represent the author's thoughts? You're like, well, how do I figure that out? Well, that comes with your Bible reading, doesn't it? If you're reading through the Bible for devotions and all that, probably by the time you're in the church for 20 years or so, you'll have a good idea of what some of these authors taught. But as far as if you're new, you'll need to read around that verse, maybe the chapter, maybe the whole book. Like when I did James, I read the whole book in one sitting. And you say, well, where did you have? Sabbath afternoon, I got done preaching, had my fellowship meal with the church members. I went home, and you can read through some of these books in an afternoon, in part of an afternoon, and get the as Kenneth Cox says, the eagle eye view, the big view of it. So do the isolated verses correctly represent the author's thoughts? So if you chose the 12 verses of James 3 like we did, does it really represent all his thoughts as far as an immediate context? Or does it seem like it's taken out of context? Did I choose just a subpoint now? And now all of a sudden I realize that, it's a subpoint. It's not even the main point. That's okay. You can go back through and read it again and say, okay, what was the main point here? And some of you are saying, wow, this seems like a lot of work, but it's simple. You read through it till you get the main point, the subpoint, then you make sure it fits in the context. And so what I do, I take the entire passage and I look at the whole context. And let's look at James 3. And I read that again, and you probably have read it. James 3, just like in your handout on page 4, it mentions could be used for perfection theology. But really, it's about words in the heart, really, isn't it? It's about bad words and good words and really the source. And another example is when I came across this passage, when I was thinking about preaching on it and when I was preparing for this, I immediately thought about how, it is about perfection theology if Jesus isn't in it, right? You know, my challenge with words began when I was 17 years old in the Douglas County Jail. Every other word was a cuss word or an aggressive word. And I became a Christian, and immediately the Holy Spirit did what Jesus said, convict me of sin, of righteousness, of judgment. So here's a whole nother sermon. If I'm reading through James 3, my experience tells me from real life that if I'm focusing on controlling my words by myself, well, guys, I never would have quit cussing. That's just the reality of it. But what happened was I was convicted of sin. I immediately was thought of people who didn't cuss, like my grandpa and others, and I said, they're Christians, so should I keep talking like this? And then the thought came to me that I don't think Jesus would talk like that. And I don't think Jesus would say this. And that's not right. And I want to see Jesus soon. And that's where the judgment part comes in. We want to see Jesus soon. And my motivation was there. And so I went ahead and went to the front of my Gideon's Bible, which they gave out there in the jail. And I found where it said cursing. And I looked through and I saw all these verses and I read them. That's like reading James chapter 3. You're reading about good and bad words. And you're like, well, what do I do with it, Lord? And then that's what I said, what do I do, God? What do I do? That's not perfection theology. That's crying out to God and submitting your heart theology. So if you get into James 3 and you tell the people, just stop it, just stop cussing, just stop gossiping, you're getting to perfection theology and you're not getting into actually what James is talking about. Because if you read chapter 1, you find if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God who gives to all men liberally. That's verse 5. And you get over to chapter 3 where the words are, and chapter 4 says, draw nigh to God, right? Submit yourselves unto the Lord, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw near to you. James 4, verse 7. So you have this whole context. And if you are writing an outline, and you've got your main point and your subpoints, and you're starting to flesh it out, you got to then say, does it really represent the thought of the author? If it's not, and I'm taking something out of context, something's going to sound weird in this. Something's not going to be right in this. So that's where you need to get that whole portion. So you see this picture over here. This is Bryce Canyon. Went there in May a couple of years ago, and it was getting ready to snow that day. And as you look at this picture, this is a beautiful picture. If you took it in its totality and made a panorama of this, you would feel like you're just in an amazing place. And those of you who've been there, you know. But the clouds did so much for that day, didn't it? Look at that. I mean, that contrast. And if you look further out there, there's a plateau, and further past that are some hills with snow on them. And I was looking at those hills and the clouds, but let's say I just took a picture of those hills and clouds. That's what it looked like. But that's not what brought me there that day, is it? What brought me there that day was Bryce Canyon. So if I just took a picture of the hills and the clouds and said, wow, look at those beautiful hills and clouds, that's okay, but that's not representing the whole totality of the picture, is it? And that's what we're talking about. If you got a main point and subpoints, and yet the rest of the book seems to be at odds with you, then you need to read again and say, okay, Lord, is there something I'm missing here? Or is it my thinking that's getting in the way here? And my way of thinking about you, my theology, is it getting in the way here? And if so, you may have to go through and reword your little basic outline and reword it differently. So that's the representative portion. And by the time you have a simple point, a representative portion, at that point, you start developing more of a complete picture. You've got your main point and some subheadings, and then you've read it through, and you know what's going on in the rest of the book. Just like you're like, well, how did he spout off those verses? Well, those are verses I memorized soon after I started going to church, because I needed wisdom, because I was going to community college and all this. So when I think of Book of James, I don't think of works at all as far as, this whole faith versus works thing that people see in there. I see faith and works, faith that works. I see that God is powerful in that book. It's a beautiful book. So I have a simple point. I know what the rest of the book says, and that's taken years to really hone that to the way I know it today. And at first, you won't necessarily know all that. You just have to keep reading it. And then a complete picture starts emerging. And that complete picture, once again, if you're getting towards the end of your outline and you seem like you think everything's together, then pause and ask these questions. Is any part of the puzzle missing? Is there anything seem to be missing? Does it seem to be out of line with the rest of the book? Now, this almost sounds like the previous step, but it's a little different. Now if you have time to do this, sometimes you don't, then you should do this. But if you don't have time to do it, what's going to happen is you're preparing through the week, your 5-day plan to get through the week. And you get down Thursday, because I try to have mine done by Thursday, and you're letting it rest and it's sitting on your mind. And then maybe Friday, you pick it up again to just go through, and something seems missing. Then you already completed this step, because you've thought about it again, and all of a sudden something seems missing. Something isn't right is how it comes to my heart. Something's not right, Lord. And so then what I do in James 3, I would then look at the whole chapter, reread the passage again, and then make sure, and this is just double checking your work. If you want to be scientific about it and get down through the week, double check your work after everything seems outlined and typed out. Read it through a few times. If something seems missing, then take these questions out of your handout on page 4 and 5 and go through those questions. So what I'm going to do is look over at your handout with you. And we've covered page 4. You probably read it, but I'm just giving you illustration to it. And page 5 told you to go ahead and write your text down. Some of you may have done that already. And we'll be focusing on page 6 in a few moments here. So I'm going to pause. Let me go back here. And I'm going to end my sharing. I'm going to go back here. Come on, get bigger. Give me one moment here. I don't know why it's not pulling it up. All right, stop my share. Come on. And I'm going to open it up and see if there's any questions so far, because that's a lot to bite off for. Okay, I thought we were outlining here, but those are the 3 components of a good outline. You got to do that. Any questions so far? If you need to unmute, go down to the bottom left corner down there of your screen, and you'll see your microphone button pop up. It looks.
Is that right now?
Got you, Charlotte.
Forgot my question.
Okay.
Oh, I keep, my screen keeps re-entering and I miss a whole section of your presentation. Can you help me with that?
Let me think for a moment. What's it look like when that happens?
Well, it just goes back to the community with Zoom, and then it puts a little picture to click back in,
Oh, it's
and then
kicking you
it
off.
kicks me out again. I've been out 3 or 4 times and I missed some.
I'm sorry about that. It could be either your internet connection or mine. Is anybody else having that trouble? So it could be
No.
it could be the broadband. It's not your fault. It's just your internet can be slow today, like on Saturday morning. And
Well, Pastor made the comment here that his wasn't working a little bit. It was a little bit slow or something.
Well,
okay.
we're in the
So-
same community, so
Yeah.
perhaps we're
So
having trouble.
Yeah, it might be the area here.
Okay.
So
Okay.
Let me summarize real quick. So
Okay.
you got your simple point.
Yes.
That's your main guy. Your subpoints. Then you try to figure out, okay, does that fit in the rest of the chapter and the rest of the book? And that's your that's what we're talking about. I'm going to go to your note sheet instead of my screen so that you don't get maybe kicked off. It could be that there's too much coming through on my end. Like if all these pictures and stuff are coming through and my voice and my video, it could be too much for internet connection sometimes. So on page 4 there, and I'm going to summarize it just in like 1 minute here. So you have your verses, like we had James 3, and you're reading through there, and it appears like words is the main topic, right? It's the main subject.
Mhm.
So I write that down, and then I look down through, because that's my simple point, and then I say, okay, as I'm reading down through, why did I stop at verse 12? Well, as you read down through, you'll see why you stopped at verse 12. It kind of seems to go on to a different subject there. In fact, I'll open my Bible and read down through here real quick and point that out. So let me go over here. So James 3, there's a couple of indicators. Number one, if you have a study Bible, it's probably going to have a division mark there. It's going to have another heading coming up, like mine does. Or as you look into your English Bible that doesn't have little headings, like in chapter 3, verse 1, it says the untamable tongue. In chapter 3, verse 13, it says heavenly versus demonic wisdom. So my Bible helped me actually narrow down my text that way. But as you're reading through it, you know the main point is words. You're looking through, you're reading it, and all of a sudden, verse 10, out of the same mouth proceeds blessing and cursing. These things ought not to be so, brethren. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. So you see the shift there? It goes from words to all of a sudden, who is wise among you? So that helps you realize that by reading a representative portion, and if you kept reading the chapter, you would see, okay, I have a good passage to stop at here. And 12 verses is a lot, but so I got my main point is words. My subpoints are all these descriptions of words from verses 1 to 12. And then the chapter shifts. And later on, it'll tell you how you can really overcome the devil and all of that, which is drawing nigh to God in chapter 4. So as you take your simple point, you then take a portion that seems to represent that point, which is the first 12 verses. And then, number 3 on page 4 there, is it a complete picture? If I preach about words and leave people feeling hopeless because they struggle with words, is that really where I should leave them at? Or is the rest of the book of James tell me something more? And well, it does. It tells you in chapter 1, verse 5, God can give wisdom. It tells you in chapter 4, verse 7, that you can draw nigh to God. And so you have, if you read the whole book, you'll realize, okay, James is not leaving us hopeless here. We may feel that way. And we may feel like, well, I have good words and bad words that come out of my mouth. And Jesus says it's the heart, your heart. But James doesn't leave you hanging there. He tells you what you can do. So you're going to have to figure out, because I heard somebody preach on James and they just said, you just stop it. Just stop gossiping. That's not of God. That's not of Jesus, right? First of all, and I'm thinking, well, I typically don't deal with gossiping because I shut it down before it starts in my church. if I can, I talk about Matthew 18, and to people, if they try to come to me, even as a pastor, I'll say, oh, have you talked to that person yet? Right? So I have ways I try to nip it in my own personal life. So the person's pointing the finger at me and making me feel guilty, which I'm okay with feeling guilty every once in a while. I'm okay with conviction. But the text really isn't doing that. The text is pointing out the reality of there are good words and there are bad words. There are creative words and there are words of destruction. And the choice is yours today. Would you choose life? And if you feel like you struggle with the words and all that, you lead them to Jesus. That's what happens at that point in the sermon. So your complete picture of James is not finger pointing. Your complete picture of James is hope. They can draw nigh to God and resist the devil, and he will flee for them, in James 4, verse 7. So that's why I was saying, simple point. Then you read a bigger portion, which may be the whole book, and then you get it helps you then take your outline, which is your main point, and your little subpoints, and then you say, okay, is there anything missing? Does anything not sound right here? And that's where you begin to refine that brief outline that you made.
Thank you.
Yep. That was more than 1 minute, but that's okay.
Well, I also found you're speaking about reading the whole thing. I went clear back and read clear through James, and the picture changed completely to what I was thinking.
Yes.
So thank you.
Yeah. It seems like we would do that in any other field, right? If we're in the scientific field, or if we're in, like my wife is big into science. She basically teaches science, high school science, to my kids, but she's very thorough, and she has, you don't just study the cell, right? Eventually you study a whole organism. Or they were looking under the microscope the other day at mold, and it was more complicated than they thought, right?
Yeah.
So, but that's the thing with a sermon. If we're going to do that for other fields, then the same thing goes with a sermon, is that we're going to be thorough. Maybe we can't be thorough every single week if you're preaching every week, but you could be thorough leading up to that sermon series. If you're preaching every week for a month, you could plan ahead and read it through in sections if it doesn't work in one sitting. And I don't know, I think James is a small book. You could read it pretty quickly. So yeah, you're right. It gives you that whole overall context. And then you're able to take your outline and say, doesn't quite sound right. Or that sounds like what I read further on. It kind of leads up to that. So.
Thank you.
And probably what I'm going to do now, guys, is I'm going to go to your handout so that we don't have this distortion for a little bit here, because I don't want to have you miss anything based on a video slideshow. So I'm going down to page 6. And you may not have time to do this right now, but maybe after lunch you could spend some time going through and reviewing these things here on page 6, especially number 1 and 2. We're not going to have time to go through how to study the Bible basics, but I would presume that you know how to look things up on either in a concordance, or on the internet, on the Blue Letter Bible, or internet has so many commentaries on it now, you don't even need a whole bunch of commentaries. In fact, there's one website that I'll put up later on in the chat. It's eSword, and eSword is every pastor who can't afford Bible Works, which is a $300 program, gets eSword usually. And what it has is it has commentaries. You can get an Ellen White component where it'll put in all her devotionals, and that was new to eSword. They're not an Adventist thing. They're a non-Adventist program. You can download that program onto your laptop, your home computer, or I don't think it's on Android yet. I think it's on Apple phones. But you can download that and use that to collect your facts. You look down here at number 2, like, well, where do I get the Bible commentaries, or where do I get the history of these things? Well, most of the time now you get them off the internet. And it used to be the rabbinical writings of the rabbis in the 1st century and 2nd century used to not be available, except for when you go to Andrews University Library or another university library. It had all these shelves of the teachings of the rabbis. And so I remember going in there, and that's the only place I could access them for several years. But now they put them all on the internet, and you can get these things. And so there's an assumption I have that you know how to read broadly, which is what we just talked about. You know how to collect some simple facts. And it may be that now you're saying, I need to have a little help with the outline. And that's what we're going to focus on, is how to do an outline. And if you remember from years ago when they taught you Roman numerals and how to do the outline that way, that's how I still do it. That's from when I was a kid.
Old school, yeah.
Old school.
Yeah.
It's safe.
It's safe, and you can tell if something's going wrong as you're going down. So when we talk about outlining the text, you got your main point, and on page 7, I want to talk about the main point a little bit before we move on with it. You will hear in preaching classes, and this is for those who want to have a little extra information, you will hear people say the homiletical idea, the preaching phrase, the preaching idea. And Derek Morris, who Pastor Dan was talking about, who did a refresher course, he also did that same refresher course where I was at. And he said you need to have your subject, your complement, your homiletical idea, and your preaching idea. I mean, that's 4 things. And frankly, by the time I got through the 3rd one, I said, I know what my preaching idea is. I don't want to have to write a whole manuscript that I keep repeating the preaching idea when I had it there in the homiletical idea. It's the same thing to me. So I axed it. But on number 4, you want to take, there is validity to taking and figuring out from your text, what's the main idea, what's the sub ideas that complement it. So you think about subject, complement. That's what Hayden Robinson talks about in his book. And that's why if you want to get all into technicality and write your manuscript full out like the way Robinson wants, you're going to need to really know subject, complement. For those of us who don't really want to deal with that language, we have the main point and sub points of the text. Whichever language you want to use, it's the same thing. So let's go over to page 8. And this is what we're going to have to do. This is a sheet where you can make a copy and use it over and over again, or you can go onto Word and retype it and space it out more if you want. Or you can send me an email and I'll send you the whole file in Word, and you can go through and take this syllabus and spread up, give yourself more space if you want to do that yourself. But it says here, do it yourself. Take the anchor text that you choose, or you chose in the last session, and study it. Now, some of you may have said, no, I'm going to go with James 3 because I don't want to try to apply this yet to another text. That's okay. Those others of you may have written down another text. That's okay. I'm going to be taking you through James 3. And here are the questions. As I read James 3, question number 1, who and what are the characters that play a part in this story? So, well, there's no story there. It's all about words. Oh man, there are so many stories in this thing. As I look at it, I'm going to go back over here again. Who and what are the characters that play parts in the story? Not just humans, though. Think about that. Let's look at this first. Let's see if you can use your imagination for a moment and see the different scenes the way I do. My brethren, let not many of you, verse 1, become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. What do you see? What comes to mind?
Congregation.
Okay, congregation, someone talking to the congregation. When I say teachers, what comes to mind?
Preachers.
Sabbath school.
What's that, Bill?
Preachers.
Preachers, okay. Anybody see a chalkboard with a teacher going up to it? I mean,
Said teacher.
Mine says teachers. Yeah.
Okay. Your mind will sometimes put a picture there based on a preconceived idea. So if we're in a preaching class, sometimes you'll think of someone standing up front, or Sabbath school, because we're talking about church preaching and teaching, right? But he's talking about teachers in general. So you're dealing with, yes, teachers in the church, but also teachers in general. And some people will have a word picture that comes to their mind. Back then, you'd have to say, well, where did all the teachers teach at? Well, they didn't always go to the synagogue, right? Small groups in homes. You have people teaching out in public. But we're talking about a group of people who are scattered, according to James chapter 1, verse 1. And James is trying to encourage the ones who are teaching them to mind their words and to really be careful with their words.
They're at a higher standard.
Yes.
Yeah, we're at a higher standard.
And that could be intimidating if you just take that one verse.
Mm-hmm.
And typically we take that one verse and we read it. Usually we read it during preaching class. They read that to us at the bachelor's level and when we did the theology of preaching. But I didn't hear it again after that, mainly because it was taken out of context. I'm not saying it didn't have anything to do with me, but you keep reading, that's just one picture. So overall, the audience there he is talking to teachers and those who are leading the flock, but he's also trying to get you sucked into a word picture here, these teachers. And a teacher in Israel, by the way, is different than a teacher in a Greek society. You ever wonder why Jesus is seen walking next to his disciples, talking in one rendition of the Sermon on the Mount area, that whole context? You'd say, well, one time it looks like he's walking next to his disciples. The other time he's up on the mountainside talking to the multitude. They're like, well, some people say that's because the Bible's not accurate. No, because Jesus was appealing to do different teaching styles. He's appealing to the teaching style that does talk to the crowd, is a mosaic type of audience, but that's a style that the philosophers use. They would walk beside their disciples and teach as they went along the way. So you have teachers, and you can picture whoever they are responsible for their words. They are given responsibility of sharing those with people. And yes, we need to be careful with our words, and you all feel that. In verse 2, for we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he's a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body. Well, before the word bridle, you would think of perfection language, wouldn't you? But if you have a little footnote next to perfect, you would go back to James 1, where it talks about the mature person who's gone through trials and all of that. But now you have the word bridle. And what does that bring to mind?
Horse,
Yeah.
horse.
Yeah.
Control.
And somebody there putting it on, right? So who's in control? Not the horse.
The one putting it on.
The one putting it on. So who's putting it on? You. Like, who's in control of your life?
God.
It begs the question, doesn't it?
You hear that phrase? You hear that phrase, bridle your tongue. Bridle your...
In verse 3, we put bits in horses' mouths. So here we go again. Not just, and we have the bridle and the bit, that they may obey us. And some horses, they don't, especially when they're first being trained, that's difficult for them, very difficult for them. Not painful initially, but it's uncomfortable. And so now you have someone else is putting this on you. Someone else is putting you through something that's not necessarily comfortable, but it's necessary.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
I said to a friend of mine a while back, they don't pray together as a family, very, very seldom. And I says, try to do it every day. I says, it's going to feel uncomfortable at first. And he says, yes, it would. And it is. If you're not used to doing something, it is uncomfortable.
Yes.
And then pretty soon it becomes second nature, and that's what with the bridle or the bit, it becomes second nature eventually.
That's a great illustration. Yes. So you have that, it turns the whole body. And then verse 4, look at ships. And the word there for look, if you were to look it up, is probably idu, which means behold. All of a sudden, the author is telling you, here's another scene, a ship floating out there. Look at it. And you don't need to know Greek to know that. You just look at the author in English. He's telling you, look. And now all of a sudden, your scene is changed. Ships, plural, not just one, ships. They are so large and are driven by fierce winds. You can picture that, right? They're turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. So then the question is, who's the captain of the heart, of the soul? You could preach Jesus in every single one of these verses. And then it goes down here, and this one's very familiar. See how great a forest a little fire kindles, or a great forest fire, a fire kindles? The tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. A world. I mean, look at this. James has packed so many words in such a short space that you have word pictures about words that you could talk about for multiple sermons. And then again, the question is, who rules our world? Who's our prince, our ruler? And who then can control that forest fire? That can happen in our hearts, and we know that can happen. Angry words in the word anger in the Hebrew way of thinking is fire. Okay, you go to the Old Testament, you start looking for the word anger, you'll actually find the redness of the face is one of the translations, but also a sub one is this idea of a fire burning. Who can control that? Well, we know sometimes we don't control that. We know sometimes we've messed up and we've gotten angry at people, maybe said some words that we regretted. And the question is, what can I do with that, Lord? I feel so helpless sometimes when that happens. And you're like, well, anger management, right? Well, that'll help, but also trust, they say, in the divine power in all those anger management classes. So even the secular world acknowledges that God is needed for that. And I should know, I went to those classes. So you have this fire in this world. You can almost picture the world going on fire. Who can put it out? Who can take care of it? And then it goes down to death into verse 6. The sets on fire by hell. And you might have a footnote down there that tells you more about that little word, Gehenna, the garbage pit that burns up, right? To keep the fire going. In Jerusalem, we drove right by Gehenna. They said, "Oh, there it is. There's a place where they would burn the garbage." And some people, I don't know if the tour guide knew exactly what he was saying, but they call it Gehenna, this fire burning place where they would burn the trash down there. So you have this picture of fire, trash being burned up, the world being set on fire. All of a sudden, it reminds you almost of the cleansing at the end of time. But you're like, well, James really didn't have that in mind, did he? No, his main focus is you don't have to be part of a world on fire. You can have that fire quenched. And you're like, well, how? It didn't say right here. Well, that's where the rest of the verses tell you, and the rest of the verses in James tell you it's God who can do that. Then verse 7, every kind of beast and bird or reptile and creature of the sea, wow, you could really get imaginative there, is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. And we've seen that in zoos, right? We've seen SeaWorld, Monterey Bay, lots of creatures that have been brought into captivity. And back then they had some of that as well. In fact, all the way back to Babylon, they had not only the garden in Babylon, but some favorite animals of the queen in Babylon that would have been tamed. So a Bible listener would say, yeah, that happens. We tame ferocious animals, even lions sometimes. Not totally, but somewhat. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. Now all of a sudden, something might come to mind there. Poison from the mouth. What comes to mind when we say that? Say it again. Tongue. Okay. What animal has poison coming from its mouth?
Snake.
Snake.
Snake. Right?
Yeah.
Serpent. You brood of vipers, John called them. So you have more language coming here that could generate another character, a snake, or not very many other things would have that. Not very many others. With it, now we get to the crux of the matter. With it, we bless our God and Father, and with it, we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God or likeness of God. Out of the same mouth proceeds blessings and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. And you're like, well, okay, then what can I do? Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Of course, the answer is no. So now you see a spring of water, and you see, if you've been to a spring where actually the water source begins, you know what that looks like. I saw one in Jerusalem area. near the Sea of Galilee. So you have this spring of water coming out, and everybody knows it's not going to be bitter, or some versions may say something differently there, and you may want to look that up. I don't know. And fresh. Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? This is rhetorical. Of course not. Your answer is no, right?
No.
Thus, no spring yields both salt water and fresh. If you wonder what it meant, he's telling you right there, salt water and fresh. So the two shouldn't go together. Why is it in my life that it seems like sometimes the two go together? That could be a life question. Or someone in your audience, it could be their life question. And then you're going to have to go somewhere else, either in the rest of the book of James to answer that, or New Testament. Jesus' words come to my mind. And you're going to have to give them hope. Because just to point out the words issues and leave people without hope will leave them to try to attain it in their own perfection. And that's going to be folly. But if you think of the rest of the book, like chapter 1, verse 5, if you ask of God, he'll give wisdom. Chapter 4, verse 7, other places in there are other good news. James can give you the answer. And since you know the rest of the Bible, you know other answers as well. So, go ahead.
I was going to just say that last verse is the last sentence. No more can salt water yield fresh. And when you think about it, nothing pure makes wickedness pure. It's the wickedness always contaminates the good. And that was why God said, don't mingle with the people in Israel, because you're going to be contaminated. You know, very seldom does anything good make something else good, but the good always gets contaminated.
Yeah, the evil will contaminate good.
Yeah.
We all know, even here in California with desalinization, what process that takes. It's very costly.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
that last one could bring out a whole bit of a sermon about the cost of the changed heart. I mean, you could go in a lot of places with this. In fact, you could preach several sermons just on words. After a while, your audience might get a little bit, okay, guys, we've heard enough here. Or maybe you could spread it out over several years where you could touch James every once in a while on this topic. And so down here on number 3, so number 1, who are the characters? Number 2, what are some ideas or insights? We did that. We kind of went down through and we're imagining things. Can you divide the story into scenes? Okay, maybe a little bit different. I mean, you can see here where it shifts from word picture to word picture. If you want to do scenes that way, you could. And if you were doing a different one, like a story of Jesus or a parable, it's a little more easy. But the hard part is this. As we read through it, I'm sure other sermon ideas came to mind besides what I mentioned, what others mentioned here. You got to say to yourself, I am not going to preach all this at one sermon. I am not going to preach all this. I will not put all this into my sermon because it's too much.
Well, yeah.
So down here, if you wanted to have an outline sample, it's right down there. You can look at it. This was Dr. Wibberding's example. I would probably maybe do a little differently, and so would you. But if you need some kind of sample, how he took the 12 verses and he divided it up, you can see what he did there. That's Dr. Wibberding's there. So when you're going from week to week, you'll have this to look back on and say, well, can I really take my text? Here's the main idea. Here are the sub-ideas, the complement. And can I make a sermon series out of it? And I want to talk about, I don't see it in there. Let me see here. Let me go back because I think we skipped over. I wanted to give you an example of subject and complement. So I'm going to have to share my screen here to do that. Hopefully we don't lose anybody. Go down here.
I'm going to have to leave and go set up some microphones.
Okay.
So
no problem.
Sorry.
You're fine. We're about ready to break here. Let me find
okay.
find the subject complement. All right. So I'm going to give you one example when we're done. So write down, as you're reading through it, the single memorable statement that comes to mind as you're reading through all of that. And that will be what we call your subject. And the rest will be called your complement or your subpoints. For instance, your handout gives you this. James is talking about the power of words. Their goodness or badness depend on their source. And it's really the heart. The heart. You say, well, I don't like the way they worded that. That's okay. You can do it yourself. And now we have time for questions. And your assignment later in the day is to look at page 8 on your own with your own verse if you have it, or you can look over and skim through it before we go on here during our break if you want to. So we're going to take any questions briefly, and we'll take a break until 11. And I'm going to put in the chat your Zoom information. If you need it right away, it'll be right there. But if you have it on your email, just pull up your 11 o'clock one right at 11, and we'll go on from here, and we'll take that little outline and we'll begin to analyze it some more and refine it.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you for whatever you did. I haven't blacked out.
It was too much to have all the slides, I think. I think that's what's going on.
You're
We'll
not
try
supposed to put it all in, you know?
We'll try again after 11 o'clock and see if it works better that way.
Okay.
All right. Are we all good, or are you? All right. So
on the boot camp we did at NAD a couple months ago, there was a lot of emphasis on time management. Putting that forward to the main points and subpoints, we probably need to be cognizant of time spent at each point for the congregation too.
Yes.
There's not an overemphasis on one without the other.
yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Like, what if you emphasize your subpoints over your main point? Well, then all of a sudden they become your main point.
Right, right.
In the same way, the other way around, your main point, you could overemphasize it and you have nothing to bolster it with, and people are left saying, all right, where did that come from?
Right. You're building on the sand, not the rock. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Anything else before we break?
Good.
I see you over there.
Okay.
All right. See you guys at 11 o'clock. Choose the 11 o'clock link in the email, or use it over here from the chat. Grab it before. I'll be on for a couple more minutes. You can grab it, and then we'll see you at 11 o'clock.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, now.
So I'm going to go ahead and log off here and end the meeting. And if you need the Zoom link from the chat, go ahead and get it, or you can get it from your email.